Now that 11th edition has officially been out for just over 2 weeks, it's time for me to turn my initial thoughts and opinions into unambiguous objective statements about how amazing or terrible everything is, to confirm once and for all if this new edition will cause 40k to ascend into a new golden era of perfectly balanced narrative and competitive coexistence, or collapse into the shadowy pit of abject failure, signaling the destructive downfall of the entirety of Games Workshop as a business. For this edition, I wanted to ensure that I was as knowledgeable and informed as possible in order to provide the most balanced analysis of the new updates. As a content creator, I feel like it's my duty to provide valuable, unbiased information without falling into the reactive, clickbait-riddled negativity that proliferates the cultural death spiral of hostile pessimism that's all too common across the internet nowadays. When I released my 10th edition first impressions video, I had only played a single game of 10th. That is unacceptable and frankly irresponsible considering my growing platform at the time. I've matured a lot since then, not just as a content creator, but also as a person in general.
PW said, everyone must have crabs. Those little scam artists.
Or maybe it's a cave. It doesn't have to be a city, it could be a cave ruin. How do you ruin a cave? Why don't you go ask your mum? And I now know that one game of a new release, or in fact a singular instance of anything, is never going to be enough data or experience to actually construct a proper informed conclusion. I didn't want to repeat the mistakes of my past and simply play a single game of 11th and then make massive sweeping judgments about all the new rules and systems that have been created or updated. I needed to take the time to get enough hands-on experience to get a proper feel for everything, deep diving wholeheartedly in order to fully scrutinize all the potential nuances and subtleties of this edition, before I felt comfortable enough in discussing all aspects of 11th. And so, over the past few weeks, I have played 2 games of 11th edition 40k. 10th edition was a pretty big paradigm shift due to the updated datasheets, so 11th wasn't ever going to make as many drastic changes. The changes made here are built upon the foundations of 10th, whilst also reining in some of the problems 10th caused. There are a couple of things that haven't changed, though. Firstly, despite me technically being a paid professional 40k player now, I still managed to lose both my first 2 games. I'm still playing my Raven Guard successors, the Screaming Ravens, as the updates to missions and list building make the playstyle I spent 10th developing still a hell of a lot of fun, and I think decently strong as well. Also, to be fair, one of these games was against Toby, whilst I was on the bad side of one of, if not the, most unbalanced missions in the entire game. The other was against Steve and his Chaos Knights, and I never win those because Knights are bullshit and people who play them are cowardly little bitches. And the second thing that's never changed is I still transport my minis in my back super from templatstronger.com. I'm going to basically run through the game chronologically to break down all the changes and what I think of them. So let's start from the very beginning with list building. List building isn't going to feel all that different from 10th in terms of how you actually create the army, whether you use the official 40k app or one of the myriad third-party apps. You aren't going to suddenly be confused and disorientated when picking what units you want. Adding in some war gear costs for big choices and paying attacks for multiple units are both decent balance levers that can be pulled without going back to full war gear choices, which overall don't matter too much. We'll get to this later, but things like pistol choices on sergeants feel like they matter way less now. I've always advocated for not bringing war gear cost back. I like the way it was done on things like Scourges. For them, taking a heavy weapon like a Dark Lance changes the role of that unit from a deep striking distraction or scoring piece to a dedicated anti-tank unit. So splitting the unit into 2 datasheets with different abilities to help facilitate those roles makes sense, and they can be pointed appropriately. That doesn't stop the Dark Lance being the clearly superior choice though, and picking a different heavy weapon doesn't change the role of the unit that much, so adding war gear back in that case is fine. Some places where I think this has worked well is the Assault Terminators paying a price for the Thunderhammer and Shield versus Lightning Claws. I think that's probably one of the better implemented choices. Both versions are now viable depending on if you want a cheaper, stabbier unit or a tanky unit, and both are cost appropriate. But an example of this not really working is the Redemptor Dreadnought. At least in my opinion, I might end up being wrong on this, but my initial thought is that Redemptor without Plasma is just not very good. So you will always pay the premium, and if the cost with Plasma is too high, saving 10 points for a bad weapon isn't going to make you take it. If they make the heavy Onslaught Gatling Cannon version too cheap though, you take it, but not for the weapon, you take it because it's an uncosted T10 12 wound -1 damage body. And at that point, the weapon choice doesn't matter at all. I imagine that across all of the factions, there's a lot of good and bad examples, and overall this is a positive change that will help future balancing. You also now add leaders to units as part of the list building process. And to be honest, I think most people did that implicitly. Now it's just explicit. This changes some things we'll get to later, but overall it's a fine change, unless you were using an iPhone in the first few days of the app being updated, where adding a leader to a unit, then deleting the unit caused the entire app to crash and your list to become inaccessible. Nice one, Gita. So whilst the actual creating part of your army list is similar, what isn't similar is what choices you make thanks to the new force dispositions system. In 11th, when you select your detachments, you get a choice of force disposition based on those detachment choices. And which one of those force dispositions you choose versus which force your opponent chooses will determine the primary mission that you will play. And these primary missions are asymmetrical now. Apart from if you play an opponent with the same force disposition as you, those mirror matchups are obviously not symmetrical. Don't be a bloody pedant. Eagle-eyed listeners will notice I said detachments, plural. Each detachment now costs a certain number of detachment points, or DP. And I'm going to nip this one in the bud right now. It was already so goddamn annoying going, oh my god, Hank, no, don't abbreviate command points to CP. Like, yes, we get it. We know, we get it, okay? Funny, haha, but it's a 2-letter acronym in a specific context, so you know what it means, okay? Let's not do the same thing with DP, all right? Just... I'll take the bullet for everyone, okay? Get it all out your system in the comments below this video, and then never mention it again, okay? In a 2,000 point game, you can get up to 3 DP. As of now, most attachments are 2 DP, with a smattering of 3 DP ones for heavy hitters like Blaze of Ultramar, and then each faction gets 3 single DP detachments. So for example, you could play an army that is Shadowmark Talon plus Librarius Conclave, and then you'd have a choice between either of the force positions those provide. However, the big thing here is that you can now build your army list with the disposition in mind. You don't like have to think about all the possible primary missions or worry about certain primaries being way harder for you to achieve. You could tune your list to your battle plan. 36 Centurions don't have to try actioning anymore. It can just go purge the foe and kill stuff. If it was a legal list anymore, which unfortunately it's not. There are 5 dispositions: purge the foe, take and hold, priority assets, disruption, and reconnaissance. I really like this system, but I think it's going to take a little while to fully mature. For starters, each faction only has 3 single point detachments, with most being 2, so choices are fairly limited, especially in cases where one is just clearly better. Librarius Conclave is just too good, so a lot of list building comes down to picking your favorite playstyle with a Stern Guard brick in it. There's also a heavier leaning towards purge the foe or take and hold, which is understandable early in the edition. This is something that might balance out over time, and honestly it might be something that keeps the meta in check, because if one disposition starts to heavily outweigh the others, people might start to make counter lists with a specific disposition, which will be interesting to see. There are some initial balance issues, as there was always likely to be, although this is something that I think will need some time to be fully understood. Saying that though, Disruption versus Recon, which was my first game, is kinda bullshit. To get points as a disruption player, you need to do actions on objectives that you control to place a marker on them, and then the number of markers you get is the number of points you can get at the end of your turn. The Recon player can remove these markers by moving onto the objective, not controlling it, not actioning it. They can even be battle shocked. We even played it on the map that gives disruption 4 points per objective instead of 2 for some of them, because all the objectives are partially in enemy territory. But the Recon player gets 5 points for removing all of them, which really isn't that hard. And they have to do a single action for 4 points, which is look at something. As Recon and Disruption both lean into having a good number of units, this is really trivial. Despite that though, the game still ended up being fairly close, 93 to 81, because Disruption has the advantage of being able to score a lot of points early. So this is where I'm thinking some weird jank stuff can happen. To max out primary as the Disruption player, you could absolutely do it in 3 turns. So there's potential you can make a list that essentially plays 3 rounds of 40k to max primary and just hope you have decent secondaries that you can grab with your remaining forces. But if you made that really skewed list, it only really works against Recon, and in a tournament, you're not likely to get Recon every single game unless you're very lucky. As mentioned, the primary mission you play is based on you and your opponent's disposition. When the mission is determined, you choose from 3 different maps for that mission, and these maps aren't always going to lead to the same type of game, even if it is the same mission pairing. I mentioned Recon versus Disruption having a map that is more Disruption favored, and that's due to the extra points you get for performing actions on objectives that are in your opponent's territory, which is denoted by this line here. Layout A has 2 objectives, Layout B has 3, and Layout C has all 4. Now, if you're used to 10th edition, you might be looking at this layout and thinking, Paul, where are the objectives? Well, gone are these circle objective markers. Now the terrain area itself is the objective. The biggest consequence of this change is that my best-selling merch item over at paulusbattleshock.shop is no longer needed for 11th edition, and thus this affects my bottom line. GW is literally taking money from my pockets. Now, I thought that Layout C would be the best for this matchup, as all 4 objectives get 4 points, but these 2 objectives are quite a ways away. So you could get to them early, but they're difficult to hold and very difficult to repeatedly perform the action on. Layout B B, however, I think is probably the best. You can just ignore this central one, easily hold your expansion, and quite easily hold the central objective. The opponent's expansion objective is close enough to harass repeatedly with stuff like JPIs, but this might only be true for my list specifically. A heavier disruption list might prefer layout A and slowly accumulate points over time by being defensive on the objectives in their territory. Purge versus Recon is another good example here. Whilst the points don't change depending on where the objectives are, their position can definitely change the way you approach the game. When I played against Steve, we used layout A, which I think is the most balanced. I had a decent plan of getting my JPIs onto this objective turn 2, then on turns 3 and 4, I can get these two objectives in any order because they're quite easy. However, Steve stopped that by rapidly aggressing a War Dog here and flipping the objective before I could do the action, which somewhat disrupted my plans, and I had to do the action on this objective and never got around to doing it on this one. I also forgot to ensure that after I killed a War Dog on this objective that I'd held it, so I accidentally kind of gave up holds more in round 2, which is not good. But compare layout A to layout B. There are 3 objectives that are within 4 inches of the deployment zone, making it way safer to send a single unit out to nab the objective without giving up many kills. This forces the Purge player to play extremely aggressively. Otherwise, the Recon player will very easily get away with full primary. Secondary missions have also changed. You no longer have a hand size limit. So if you don't discard a secondary mission card, you can just keep it for later and still get new cards. Also, you no longer have to score the cards if you partially achieve them. You can only gain 15 points per turn with secondaries, but you have greater control over when you play them. No longer is stuff like turn 1 no prisoners a bad thing. In fact, this adds more strategic complexity and, dare I say it, emergent narrative choices, as you now have some idea of what cards your opponent is holding and what they might be planning. This is a really cool change, and after having played a couple of games, it feels really good. Getting turns with no secondary points no longer feels crap. You can now plan around getting 3 amazing turns of secondaries if you need to. There are also only 2 action secondaries now, meaning that if you're focused on a low action primary, you don't have to be concerned about having that many action units. There are some interesting side effects from the new secondary system. In 10th, you would want to quite aggressively mill your deck if you can't score a secondary, as you don't want to have it in your hand blocking another easier secondary, and you get a command point if you discard a secondary at the end of the turn. You do still gain a command point for discarding a secondary at the end of your turn, but now that you can keep them without worrying about blocking a draw, discarding for that command point is much less desirable, and therefore the number of command points you might get in the game is reduced fairly significantly. This makes any unit that gives you command points or saves command points much more valuable. It also means that it's a lot harder to push massive point differentials. I lost both of my games, and in both I was basically tabled, but the first game was 93 to 81 and the second was still 100 to 78. Those are not bad scores. I think this is also down to my choice of disposition. Recon and Disruption both have a lot of ways to gain points quite quickly in a lot of different parts of the turn, and are both designed around having lots of units that perform actions or get around the board. So I had a pretty easy time with most secondaries and could score a decent chunk of them before being destroyed. I do have one major concern, however. I don't think it's going to be too much of an issue, but compared to previous editions, you can really condense your score into a few really good turns. In 10th edition, you were basically limited to 10 secondary points a turn and realistically 15 primary. And if you're getting lots of 15 primaries, you're already outplaying your opponent. But in any case, you still had to spread those points across the majority of the game, especially as turn 1 had no ways of scoring primary, except for Purge the Foe. In 11th, with multiple ways to gain points and the ability to stack secondaries for the perfect moment, it might just be better to simply alpha strike your opponent as hard as you can, ignoring all scoring for the first 2 turns to try and annihilate them. Then spend the rest of the game scoring big, regardless of your disposition. Let's look at the Disruption versus Recon mission again. If, as the Disruption player, I just ignore this card and throw an extremely fast and deadly army at you and completely destroy you turns 1 and 2, I can easily spend turns 3, 4, and 5 getting 12 points, and then 10 at the end of the game for max primary. And I've been stacking up secondary cards, so I could probably get 15 each turn as well. This is quite an extreme example, and to be honest, it probably isn't that viable. All the Recon player needs to do is just stay as far back as possible or redeploy around the board to avoid that. But there is the potential that the best way to build an army is to make as big of a stick as possible to smack your opponent around the head with, knowing you don't actually need to spread your scoring out as much. I mean, yes, this is basically also known as play Purge the Foe, which might be why Purge is so popular. It might be that Purge the Foe ends up being this meme, but so far I really like the new mission system and I think it has a lot of potential going forward. Okay, so you've built your list, you've determined the mission, next is to set up the terrain. As mentioned, objectives are now big terrain areas instead of arbitrary circles. Terrain is also now split into terrain areas and terrain features. This is excellent. Whether you just love L-shaped ruins like I do or want more spectacle with a unique looking battlefield, a terrain area functions identically regardless of what is on top of that area. The terrain features are also no longer split out into stuff like forests, craters or buildings. Instead, they are either exposed, light or dense. Terrain areas containing any light or dense terrain features counts as obscuring, so it doesn't matter if the area contains trees or barrels or an L-shaped ruin. If that feature counts as light or dense, the area functions exactly the same. In 10th, if you replaced a ruin with a bunch of trees, the whole map fell apart. Now, most events and most of the terrain that's going to be sold will continue to be pieces of L-shaped ruins, barricades, or these shipping containers. They are still logistically the simplest to deal with, especially at scale. They easily add some verticality to the map, and the nature of the L makes it easy to define which directions are intended to be safer from lines of sight. But changing this ruin for a similarly sized shrubbery isn't going to make a huge difference, especially due to some of the other changes to terrain and line of sight. You no longer need to be fully inside a terrain area to see through it. In 10th, if you wanted something like a tank to be able to see through this area, you need to be fully on it. If these weren't L-shaped ruins with some space underneath and were instead solid bricks, you would struggle to find a place to get the tank fully on. Now we're back to 9th edition rules, where you just need to tow onto the ruin and then it becomes true line of sight again. And because you need to be touching the terrain areas to be holding the objectives, suddenly the map will feel very open. If I put a smidge of a repex here, and you have a unit holding this objective here, I can now see you. It is still true line of sight. So if I tow onto there and you have a model there, I still can't see you, but there are still a lot of angles that will make you completely exposed to being shot from a long distance. Or at least that would be true if it wasn't for another new mechanic introduced in 11th. Hidden. Infantry, beasts, and swarms can gain hidden. If a model is touching a terrain area with at least one light or dense terrain feature, and that model's unit has not shot in this or the previous turn, they gain hidden and can only be targeted within 15 inches. This is reduced to 12 inches if they have gone to ground, which is gained if the model is not fully visible to the attacker due to a solid terrain feature. All dense terrain features have the solid rule. Quick aside, the solid keyword doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If all dense features have the solid keyword, you can just refer to the fact that it's a dense terrain feature that grants the benefit listed. This can very easily be fixed by simply adding the word can. Dense terrain features can have the solid rule. Dense terrain already differs from light terrain because of what can move through it and how you can traverse it. So there may be some instances where you want a piece of terrain that is not traversable but also not solid. I guess it's nice to have a keyword like solid when you're communicating this rule rather than having to say dense terrain feature. You can say this ruin is solid so I can hide better. But you can also just say this ruin is dense so I can hide better. So where was I going with this? Anyway, the point is your foot soldiers are going to be much safer for being blatted from across the map, even if they can technically be seen. There are ways of manipulating this detection range, but for the most part, a unit that wants to hold an expansion objective is much safer from shooting if they don't shoot themselves. Now, remember when I mentioned that pistol choices on sergeants matter way less? This is why. If you use those pistols, you lose hidden. Against Steve, my Blade Guard were in combat against a Wardog with 2 wounds left, and with my 10th edition brain, I figured I should try and get lucky and take it out with my pistols. And then I realized that what I'd done was make my Blade Guard ineligible to be hidden, which is a massive problem. Fortunately, Steve allowed me to take that back, as this was his first game. We're both still getting used to the rules, but you gotta be careful with that now. Trying to be a little bit cheeky can now cost you. So whether I have a heavy bolt, neovolkite, or plasma pistol, I'm very unlikely to want to actually use it if my plan is to remain hidden. This is the part of the game I need more time with. It's a lot to get my head around, and it feels very weird to put stuff on objectives fairly exposed because you know the enemy has to get within 15. It's going to be extremely important to check those threat ranges now, and to ensure that nothing can get a weird angle on you through a ruin. It's going to take some getting used to. So after all of that, we can finally get into the game itself. Let's tackle this phase by phase. Deployment. I think there's only one really impactful change here, and that's the change to the scout move. Having the scout's ability allows you to make a scout move if you are wholly within your deployment zone. This means no more infiltrating and scouting at the same time, which makes the scouts I bought at the end of 10th after finally giving into their power way less useful. I mean, to be fair, it was kind of bullshit to be able to infiltrate, to block, and then move into safety, and it's not all doom and gloom for scouts. If you have the scout's ability and are in strategic reserves, you can deploy anywhere wholly within your deployment zone. There's a really fun combo I've been doing, which is to infiltrate my scouts, and then use my Phobos captain to redeploy them to put the scouts into reserves, and if I go first, I can then put the scouts on my deployment line and basically do what I would have done with them anyway. Command phase. The biggest thing here is Battleshock. Battleshock tests are now done when a unit is at half strength or below, not just below half strength. Also, as leaders are attached to units at the start of the game, when a character's bodyguard is killed, that leader still counts as being part of the unit, so will need to take Battleshock tests. This is different to 10th, as when the bodyguard dies, it became its own unit at full strength. This could lead to some weird edge cases where having, let's say, a single Vanguard veteran staying alive alongside Shrike, forcing you to have to make a Battleshock test that could lose you the game if you failed, rather than have that Vanguard veteran just be dead and not having to have the heart attack. Although now that characters always count as being in a unit, it means Shrike no longer loses load up when his bodyguard dies, which is quite nice. The more important change to Battleshock is that you no longer automatically pass in your command phase. Once you're Battleshocked, you remain battle shocked until you pass. This makes battle shocking during your turn much more useful, and it means a healthy unit that is holding the objective has to pass a test in order to score. Now, as they are battle shocked, you cannot use the same bravery on them if it's important. Speaking of stratagems, they are now restricted to 1 per unit per phase. If you use any sort of stratagems to buff your units, you can only pick 1, including command point reroll. I don't think anyone is really going to be sad about this. It reduces any horrible combos that skew balance and makes things like CP reroll less valuable, reducing the overall number of stratagems you would use during a game, which is good because of the previously mentioned reduction in the number of command points you gain if you aren't discarding secondaries. Other co-op stratagems have also been changed to make them less of a no-brainer to use and more situational. For example, Tank Shock, or as it's now called, Crushing Impact, and includes monsters as well because why didn't it before, now has a chance of damaging yourself, which makes a lot of thematic sense. You're essentially throwing a tank at something, so yeah, you're probably going to cause some damage to yourself.
I don't know if you noticed, but you got a crack in your windshield.
Movement phase. There are a few changes here, and pretty much all of them are positive, or at least cleaning up some of the 10th edition jank. My favourite change, and it is quite a simple change, is the removal of the reinforcement step. Now you can ingress anything in reserves at any time during your movement phase. This is so much better. Honestly, this one change makes the game way nicer to play, especially when combined with the next change. Overwatch happens at the end of the phase. If you've played even a few games of previous editions, you might have been in a situation where for every single move you make, you had to ask your opponent if they wanted to overwatch. Now, after you've made all your moves, the opponent then chooses if they want to overwatch. You could argue that there was some skill expression in having to bait out that stratagem in a certain way, but honestly, it wasn't that skillful most of the time, and it just slowed everything down and was a complete ball ache. In any case, even if that wasn't changed, Overwatch itself has been changed so you can no longer reroll the hit roll when overwatching. This is massive. Devastating Centurions are powerful, but they were made insanely powerful due to the fact that any unit starting or ending a move within range of an objective within 24 inches of them were basically pinned. Anything with lethals or sustained with rerolls loved Overwatch as well. It was absolutely insane how much more damage you could get out of some units. Now Overwatch is much more niche, which will help with the overall balance. Coherency has also been changed slightly to stop horrible conga lines. All models in a unit must be within 9 inches of every other model. This is just a nice change to get units back to looking more like units. Some people tried to argue that that meant you could technically have 5-man units arranged like this, as all models are within 2 inches of at least one of the model and within 9 inches of all other models. And sure, let's say that this isn't complete bullshit and you're a cool person who's found a rule loophole. Why would you do that? This doesn't help you at all when you could just do this if you wanted to take up that space. I guess you could hide models and not have the middle ones exposed, but what purpose does that serve on any of these maps? Also, I might be being blind and just not being able to find it, but if that's your logic, what's stopping you in 10th from doing this? If anyone does try to do this kind of thing against you in 11th edition, you have my full permission to rip out their spine through their chest. Nowhere in the rules says you can't. Flying units of all kinds can now go through dense terrain features if they take to the skies, reducing their movement by 2 inches, but no longer having to do that absolute bollocks of measuring an angle up and over and getting bloody trigonometry out. There's not much else to this one. It's a good change, and watch out for Drukhari, because Hellions and Reavers and Venoms and Raiders and Ravagers and basically everything can now go through walls. Most abilities that force you to be outside of 9 inches of all enemies, like Infiltrate, Deep Strike, or Scout, are now 8 inches instead. This makes melt weapons better, but it doesn't change the charge roll, which we will get to when we discuss the charge phase. The other thing is that engagement range is now 2 inches instead of 1. This basically stops all of that 1.1 inch away from the wall bollocks that everyone had to do. You can also freely move through the engagement range of enemies because it's so much larger, but you cannot end within it. When playing, this was actually a lot more impactful than I first thought. 2-inch engagement range is fairly sizable. In at least one case against Steve, that 2-inch engagement range bubble blocked a pretty significant area one of his big knights could move to. Shooting phase. I've already mentioned how you gain line of sight and how towing in terrain lets you see through them, but the other big change here is what the benefits of cover are and how you gain cover. This is probably the smallest change with the biggest repercussions. Cover is now -1 ballistic skill instead of -1 AP. Let's break this down. Firstly, the change from -1 AP to -1 ballistic skill already affects how you determine who gets cover. In 10th, cover is determined by the defender, and you could have several models in a unit that have cover and several who don't. This meant when you were rolling saves, you could choose which models in the unit to make it on, which affected the roll you would need to make because of the -1 AP. Now, because cover affects the hit roll, it has to be evaluated from the attacker. As a defender, you can't say, oh, this guy has cover, so attack him first. Subsequently, this means that each attacking model in a unit has to determine if they are affected by cover individually against the whole unit that they are attacking. This has caused a huge shift in the viability of some weapons and units. AP 1 shooting is way better. Like, oh my god, it's so much better. It used to be way too easy to reduce AP 1 to AP 0, making things like autocannons much less useful. With -1 ballistic skill, more shots with AP 1 is actually a lot better. Even small arms fire like intercessors get to glow up as they can actually punch through armor more reliably. This, in turn, means that invulnerable saves are a lot better. AP being more impactful makes limiting the effect of that AP more valuable. It also means that 2-up saves are not as strong, as it's a lot easier to get them to at least a 3-up even with the smaller guns. When playing, you can really feel that change. It didn't feel like much difference when hitting, but that AP is really solid. Precision is also much better thanks to the changes on how you roll saves. In 10th edition, there were a lot of instances where you'd have to slow roll the saves. Nice easy example, Vanguard Veterans with Shrike. Vanguard Veterans have a 3-up save with no invuln. Shrike has a 3-up save and a 4-up invuln. If I had to make 11 saves, AP 2 damage 2, I cannot roll them all at once. I'd have to roll the first 10 to check for 5s, and then if all of them had failed, make a roll looking for a 4-up. For 11th, fast rolling for saves has been made an explicit rule. When you make a saving throw on a unit with multiple save profiles, you first divide the unit into groups based on their defensive profile, and choose the order in which you allocate the saves. After you roll, you take the dice in numerical order and assign them to the first group. Once all of the first group is gone, you then continue on to the other. So let's say I have Shrike with 5 Vanguard Veterans. This time it's AP 3, so saving on 6s. Damage 2, 11 attacks. I divide the unit into 2 groups, Vanguard Veterans and Shrike. The results when put in order is 1-1, 2-2, 3, 4-4, 5-5, 6-6. The 1s, 2s, and 3s kill the Vanguard Veterans, but then the remaining 6 rolls are all saved on Shrike's 4-up invuln. In 10th, I'd have to roll 5 dice, likely fail them all, then roll 6 dice for Shrike. Bear in mind that these could have been in any order in 10th. The first 5 dice could have been 3, 4, 4, 5, 5, killing the Vanguard Vets, and then the remaining 6 dice could have been 1, 1, 2, 2, 6, 6, which kills Shrike. With all attacks being rolled at once, you can potentially blank a lot more attacks, so it's much more likely that leaders are going to stick around after their bodyguard has been killed. Remember though, leaders still count as being part of a unit from the start of the game, and therefore will need to take Battleshock tests. This is where Precision's glow up comes in. If your weapon has precision, you as the attacker gets to choose the order the saves are applied to the groups. Let's do the same example attack again. Same dice, but this time with precision. Now the 1, 1, and 2 have to go to Shrike, which would kill him, and the remaining dice wipes the squad. Low volume precision is probably still about the same power-wise, but high volume precision is suddenly insanely powerful at taking out characters. The Shadowmark talent stratagem, lay low the tyrants, suddenly got a hell of a lot more use. Charge phase. Declaring charge targets now happens after you roll for a charge. You no longer have to decide who you are charging before the roll. You roll the charge, then you see which targets are viable, then you choose which ones to charge if you want to. This is really cool. I really like it, but honestly, it's not that game-changing, or at least not as game-changing as I thought it'd be. Maybe there are some smart things you can do with this, but I usually have a target that I want to charge in mind, and suddenly rolling boxcars isn't going to alter my plans. It does help for situations where you need to make a Hail Mary charge, though. You no longer have to take the risk of picking that further target. You can just give it a go, and if you get it, great. And if you don't, you can probably find a different target. This does just help keep the game running a bit quicker. You don't like have to agonize over which target. You just roll and then look after that. It didn't really change what target I would go for, but it does feel quite nice. After rolling the charge, the actual charge mechanics are a lot more interesting. Engagement range is 2 inches, so as long as the model is within engagement range, you can fight. No more second rank having to touch the first rank. It's nice and simple. Now, for the trickier part that I think some people are still getting confused by. You'd think with a 2-inch engagement range that makes charges way easier. However, in order to make a successful charge, you need to get a result equal to the distance required to be able to get into base-to-base contact with your target. This is why an 8-inch deep strike doesn't affect the charge roll. In 10th, you needed to get into engagement range, which was 1 inch. So if you were 9.99 inches away, you still only needed to roll a 9 because that would get you 0.99 inches away, which is within engagement range. For 11th, you need to be able to get into base-to-base contact. So if you're 8.01 inches away and roll an 8, you would be 0.1 inches away from the base and therefore cannot charge, even though you'd be in engagement range. Note that you only need to be able to get into base-to-base contact. In 10th, if you were able to get into base-to-base, you had to, which could lead to problems where rolling too high puts you unjustifiably into a position you'd rather not be in.
But the cream will rise to the top. Oh yeah.
In 11th, this has been relaxed. If you can get to within 1 inch of your target, you must do so. Otherwise, if you can get to engagement range, i.e. 2 inches, you must do so. Else, you must at least move closer to one of your charged targets. This also removes any stipulation of ending up closer to the nearest model, and this extends to the pile-in and consolidate steps too. You have to end up closer to the closest pile-in target, but that pile-in target is the unit, not a model. Unless it was a unit with only one model, in which case the model and unit is the same. You get my point. Maybe. I probably just confused you. Let's go over this properly. In order to declare a charge on a unit, the physical distance between the charging unit and the charge target must be less than or equal to the charge roll. This is exactly the same as if you were shooting a gun in the shooting phase. Once you've determined that, you then check to see if you could move at least one model to within 2 inches of the charge target. If you can't, the charge fails. To illustrate this in an extreme way, this unit is within charge range of the charge target, but this 10-meter wide wall prevents any of the models getting to within engagement range. If you couldn't shoot the target with a gun that has range equal to your charge roll, you cannot charge them. But if you can charge them, that 2-inch engagement range does a lot of work. Against Steve, he was worried he wouldn't be able to get a War Dog into my Blade Guard until I pointed out that all he needed to do was get here, and that's within 2 inches. The pile-in step is also a lot better. Instead of piling in when you select a unit to fight, all engaged units pile in, starting with the attacker. So you do all of your pile-ins, then the opponent does all of their pile-ins. Same with consolidates. Because of the distinction that these moves must end closer to units and not specific models, it's a little less finicky and annoying to determine which models of yours can go where. That freedom also comes with some potential tricksy moves. I've not really worked out the best ways to do this, but it feels like there are some tricks there. And I think when you play against people who do know how that fancy footwork works, it will be easier to understand for the layperson. And because of this new way of doing pile-ins, you can use them more aggressively as defenders to lock down models, as any models that are in base-to-base contact cannot make these kinds of moves. On top of that, heroic intervention has also changed. It's now a 12-inch range, and you still have to select a target that is charged. However, for an extra command point, you can pick one of your units and declare a charge on any unit within 6 inches, even ones that haven't charged. Also, heroic intervention no longer prevents you from getting fights first from charging. This 2CP version is yet to come up for me, and I don't think it'll be that impactful overall, especially due to the reduction in command points gained, so I'm most likely going to save it for other things, but it is still a nice option and does keep your opponent honest if they want to kind of stand too close. This might be something early on in the edition that will catch people out, so in these first few months, please just make sure you aren't going to gotcha your opponent with this. It's a new thing people need to get used to, so if you notice it, let your opponent know in case they forgot or maybe they didn't know it was a thing. The fight phase. One seemingly insignificant but actually extremely pivotal change is that activations start with the attacking player, not the defending player. In 10th, they started with the defending player. You do all of the fights first units first, then move on to ongoing fights. The attacking player would usually have some things they've charged with, so would have a load of fights first units, but if the defending player had any fights first, they would always pick first. This made fights first in 10th edition extremely powerful, if not completely broken. You could not charge a fights first unit, and if they heroically intervened, they would still get to activate first. Now, fights first is a lot less impactful, and in some cases, actively detrimental. A single instance of fights first is no longer that good, but multiple instances are still quite strong. On the whole, this is a good change. It makes more sense that the attacking player gets to, you know, attack first, and fights first as an ability was, like I say, borderline broken in 10th. The other change is that the back and forth activation for fighting doesn't reset after the fights firsts have been complete. In 10th, you basically divide it into 2 buckets, fights first and then remaining combats. In both steps, you alternate starting with the defending player. So, for example, in 10th edition, if as a defender I had 2 fights first units to your 1 fights first unit, I would pick first, then you would fight, then I would fight with my last fights first unit, and when we got onto ongoing combats, I would pick first again. It was a very rare niche case, but it could happen. In 11th, this is no longer true. Even if it was the final fights first unit and we're moving on to ongoing combats, the person who didn't just declare a fight goes next. This is where having a unit with the fights first ability can cause problems. If I charge your fights first unit, my charging unit gains fights first. I select that unit to fight. You then must declare your fights first unit to fight back. Then we move on to ongoing combats. I then get to pick. This means you're forced to do a suboptimal combat order. Whilst this is certainly not a good situation, it's a situation that you should be aware of and avoid if you can. You can't just throw fights first units forward now and be safe, or use them to just try and block some stuff. And that's good for the overall balance of the game, but it's bad for my Judicia-led Blade Guard, because that was really funny. 11th does feel like a better version of 10th, which is good because if it wasn't better than 10th, we'd have some real problems and we'd be very upset. There's been a decent effort to remove some of the friction from the game, and once I've got a better understanding of the new terrain and fight rules, it'll be a lot smoother to play. If 10th edition was building a new house, 11th edition is decorating and adding the furniture, and fixing some of the holes in the wall where the builder accidentally swung a ladder into it or something. And maybe some of that damage is just being painted over instead of being fixed properly, but at least until the paint fades, it looks fine. Maybe that crack in the wall will grow as we progress through the edition, and we shouldn't have ignored it, but right now, as a first impression, 11th edition is pretty cool, and I think it has a very exciting future. There's a lot more interesting, cool stuff that you can do with the rule set now. List building is more open, battlefields can be more thematic while remaining balanced. A lot of it is really awesome. I can't say it's perfect, but it's a lot better to be cautiously optimistic than overly pessimistic. Life's already shit enough without spending all your free time also being pissed off about your hobbies. Unless your hobby is to just be a shit-stirring prick on the internet and leave negative comments constantly, and that's all you do, in which case, fuck off. But for everyone else, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, go like, subscribe, all that good YouTube stuff, and stick around for more 11th edition shenanigans as I play more games. If you want to support the channel further, become a member or patron like all of these lovely people, or buy my merch, because please buy my merch. My best selling item is no longer useful unless you play literally any other game, or just want 6 copies of my face for some reason.